Hi there, BookTube. It's Roz. It's the beginning of December and time for a wrap-up of the things I read in November. And November is inextricably linked with nonfiction for me now. And I read 6 books, nonfiction books this month, but also a couple of kind of in-betweeny, not quite nonfiction, but not quite not books, and then 2 novels because I can't go a whole month without reading a novel. It just can't be done. So I'm going to start with the pure fiction, work through the kind of oddities, outliers in the middle, and then the second half of the video will be the 6 books of nonfiction, winding up with my top 2 books of the month, which were both nonfiction, as it happens. So I'm going to start with The Reader on the 627 by Jean-Paul Didierlaurent, translated by Schwartz. This came out in France in 2014 and was a bit of a bestseller, and I could see why. It's a really enjoyable book to read, but it was the closest that the month came to a disappointment for me, and I will explain why. Okay. It starts wonderfully. I loved the first sort of half of this book. It's quirky and engaging. It's set in an industrial plant with a kind of monstrous machine that chews up and pulps unsold books and converts them into grey sludge that is then taken off to be made back into paper to be made into more books. So far, so good. Our hero, Ghislaine, is disturbed by the destruction of books, and when he cleans the machinery, he manages to save the odd paper that kind of, the odd sheet that didn't quite get churned up, and dries them out and reads them to his fellow passengers on the 6:27 train that he gets to work in the morning. So bit fable-like, kind of slightly uneasy and dark. So far, very enjoyable, right up my street. The second half of the book becomes progressively warmer and sweeter. We get a kind of a love story of sorts. I mean, an unusual one. I'll never see a public loo in the same light again, and not in the sense that you're thinking. No. But for me, that the sort of warm-hearted ending to the book didn't kind of live up, or I don't know, didn't quite match up to the slightly dark oddity of the beginning of the book. So, but don't let that put you off if you are the kind of person who likes a book that has a warm and joyous resolution, because you'll probably enjoy it a lot. And the other members of my book group who also read it, almost universally loved it. Second novel I read was Maurice by E.M. Forster. Why is it we call some writers by their initials? If I said Edward Morgan Forster, you probably wouldn't know who I was talking about, would you? If you don't know who E.M. Forster is, he's a British novelist. He was born in 1879. He was kind of a member of the Bloomsbury group of, sort of that cultural and intellectual circle. He was a writer kind of all his life, but his 6 novels, which are, what he's best known for, were all written between around 1902 and 1924. 5 of them were published in his lifetime. This one was not. So this was written around 1913, and so just before the First World War. Why didn't he publish it? Because Forster was gay. All his friends and so on, and his lovers, obviously, were fully aware of that. But homosexuality was illegal in this country at that point. And this was the one book that he wrote that had sort of explicitly gay characters, gay relationships, that's the story. And he didn't feel able to be open about his sexuality in public, and didn't feel able to publish a gay novel. Particularly, he thought it was unpublishable because he was determined that this book would have a happy ending, and that was if he'd made his gay characters have a sort of awful tragic ending, it probably would have been more likely that he could have got it published. Anyway, he showed it to friends. He did share it around a bit, but as I say, it wasn't published in his lifetime. Homosexuality was legalised in the UK in 1967. Forster was still alive then. He actually died at the age of 91 in 1970, so just 3 years after legalisation. And Maurice was published in 1971, so just after his death. This was a wonderful way to end a year of reading all of Forster's novels in publication order. Thank you, Jen the Librarian, for inspiring that sort of group shared reading experience. I wouldn't have done it otherwise. I've read several of the books before, but this one I've never read, and I'm so glad I did. Definitely, a 5-star novel for me. Forster's writing style it's very intelligent. It's kind of ironical but not satirical. He's interested in human beings. He's interested in class. He's interested in relationships. He was a humanist in belief, and he really puts that into his novels. If I had one reservation about this book, and it didn't stop it being a 5-star book at all, was the quite harsh way he writes about some of the women characters in this book. And yeah, it's interesting that. Anyway, those were my 2 novels. Now, I said I had 2 kind of oddities or outliers. Well, one of those was the graphic work that I read this month, because it's somewhere between fiction and biography. It's called It Was the War in the Trenches. I don't have a copy because it was from the library. It's by Jacques Tardi, who's French. It was translated by Kim Thompson. It was published as a book in France in 1993, but as a book in English in 2010. I picked it out in particular because I'd heard good things about it, and I've never read anything by Tardi and wanted to, and it's kind of probably his best known work. And because of the World War I readathon that was happening in November, it was a vibrant readathon, I think. The Discord group was wonderful. So many wonderful books read, wonderful discussions. I only really sort of just dipped into it by reading this one thing, but what a good choice it was. Tardi based the book, or was inspired by, his grandfather's experiences in World War I, and he is writing about the French foot soldiers in the trenches, their experience. Not the officers, not the specifically the soldiers like his grandfather, whose experience was appalling, horrific, cruel, often unjust, brutal, and boy does that come through in this book. It's beautifully drawn, but very, very dark, and quite disturbing to read. It kind of is like a series of episodes involving different soldiers, and but with a character that kind of bookends it, who one presumes is based on his grandfather. Tardi made great efforts to make sure that it was historically accurate in its depiction of the war. Definitely one to read if you can stomach something quite horrific. The other oddity or outlier that I read was an anthology. That's an unusual thing for me to read, an anthology. And it was called Sista, Stanap Strong, and you will understand why I read it if I tell you that it was a collection of pieces by women writers from the South Pacific island nation of Vanuatu. And it was a mixture of nonfiction, fiction, like stories, poetry, interviews, memoir, whole hodgepodge. I read it because as you'll know, I've got this sort of long-term project to read something by an author from every country in the world, and this was the one available thing that I could find from Vanuatu. It only came out in 2021, so when I embarked on my project, I don't think there was something available, readily available in English from Vanuatu, and it's mostly in English, but with bits of Bislama, which is the sort of other or one of the three official languages of Vanuatu. Fascinating. When I make a scallydangling video about this book, I'll talk a bit more about Bislama because it's the most intriguing language. But it will suffice to say for now that it was variable in quality, the writing in this book. There were some really dire poems in there, but a wonderful reading experience because it's, the voice of women from Vanuatu that I would not hear otherwise. And which was particularly interesting to read because I hadn't understood what a exceptionally patriarchal society Vanuatu is. There you go. I will talk more about it in another video. So let's move on to the 6 kind of straight non-fiction books that I read for Non-Fiction November. And thank you again to Oliver for Book Olive for making this the character of my November reading. Now, you will know if you took part in People April that I hosted how much I enjoy memoir, biography, books about people, and you might therefore be surprised to hear that I only read one of that sort of book in November, and that was Simple Passion by Annie Ernaux, translated from the French by Tanya Leslie, her usual wonderful translator. Now, why did I read that particular book? Because Bob the Bookerer exhorted us to read Annie Ernaux in November so that he could enjoy the pun November. So, I played along. But seriously, I'm gradually reading all of Annie Ernaux's books that are available in English translation because she's a wonderful, fascinating and unusual writer, I would say. Now, this one, which I don't have because it was from the library, so I can't wave a copy up at you, but this one is one of her very short sort of memoirs that are perhaps slightly fictionalized to make them more coherent about a particular sort of incident or part of her life. And this, she did one that I've read not that long ago about her experience of trying to get a legal abortion in France at a time when that wasn't readily available. This one was about an obsessive and all-consuming love affair that she had with a married man from, I think, Russia, who was living in Paris, and she met him and became completely besotted with strong physical passion that kind of took over her whole existence almost for the period of their affair. It's written in finely crafted prose, but with quite raw emotion. But not, when I say raw emotion, she's not melodramatic in the way she conveys that. It's almost quite deadpan, but strong. It's hard really to give a sense of you have to read Ernaux to understand, I guess, what I'm describing. Why was it not a 5-star read? Because although it's a wonderfully written book, I think I had a slight reaction against reading a book about a strong, intelligent woman allowing herself to be completely subsumed in a relationship with a man. So that's me. But do read Ernaux, and this one as good as any. Now, in contrast, I guess, the next book I'm going to talk about is written by a writer who is kind of very positively trying to put female characters back centre stage in her books, and that's Natalie Haynes, and the book was Divine Might, Goddesses in Greek Myth. It follows on from, this one came out in 2023, and it follows on from her 2020 book, Pandora's Jar, which was about, female characters in Greek myths, and this is specifically about the goddesses. Pandora's Jar was absolutely a 5-star book for me. This one is similarly entertaining and erudite and delightful, but Pandora's Jar had the edge over this for me. Why? Because Pandora's Jar, I think it was refreshing or revealing in taking characters from Greek myths that we have an idea of now, and restoring almost their original character in the earliest Greek stories about them, that kind of has been sort of modified and softened and feminized over the years by male retelling, and particularly sort of modern male writers. When I say modern, I mean, from like 16th century onwards. That was the magic element of Pandora's Jar for me. This is about the goddesses. It takes a series of Haynes's favourites, and again, it takes you back to their sort of original versions, multiple versions often, because a particular goddess might have a different flavour in different parts of the Greek world. And then she combines that with, quite entertainingly, with how they're used currently in sort of popular culture and contemporary culture. So that was lovely, but it didn't have that, the sort of magic component that Pandora's Jar had for me. So 4 stars, not 5 stars, but still, a book that I loved. So let's get on to 2 more solidly factual nonfiction books that I read. Okay, and the first of those is The Future of Geography by Tim Marshall. Now, it says The Future of Geography. That's a slight misnomer. I know why he chose that title, or his publishers did, because the preceding 2 books he's written, which have been very successful, were Prisoners of Geography and The Power of Geography. So, it's sort of, they fit together. But this one which came out in 2023, is actually about space and the politics of space, the economics of space travel and exploration. Very, very interesting. He gives a kind of a potted history, I suppose, of human space exploration, with a bit about the geography of space. Then moves into who are the key players in sort of the development of space now, and why. What are the drivers? The possibility of mining precious metals on the moon or on asteroids, the use of space in communications, the use of space in for sort of military and defensive purposes. Why businesses are kind of active now in space in a way that where it used to be the preserve of countries like the USA and the Soviet Union, now Russia. It's an eye-opening book. It's one of those sort of broad brush books. I mean, Marshall allows himself to speculate, to make connections. He carries you along really well in reading the book. It's one of those books that is sort of wide and shallow rather than narrow and deep. But no worse for that. Yeah. Definitely a goodie, and I'm looking forward to reading a couple of his other books, the other 2 in the geography series. I read this one because I saw him give a talk about it, and at which I met a fellow booktuber commenter, Ian, who lives in the neck of the woods where I was staying and where this talk was, and that was a great joy. So hi Ian, and I hope you've read your copy too. Next book, also solid kind of factual end of nonfiction, kind of history this time. is, in contrast, it's the sort of deep dive into something relatively narrow, but none the worse for that. And that, well, no, before I show you this, how do you know if a non-fiction book is kind of serious, credible, based on research or kind of, solid factual content or whatever? One of the ways, I bet, is, does the book have an index? Okay. But what do you know about how indexes came to be and, why we have them and why they take the form they do? This book, Index, A History of by Dennis Duncan, is the book to explain that. Duncan, it's natural once we human beings start writing things down in an extended form, more than a single scroll or, a tablet or a couple of pages. You need to find your way to things in that writing, don't you? And how do you do that? You have to find a way, and, chapters help, and sections and titles, and, but ultimately, the ultimate tool for doing that is the index. But in order to have an index, you have to have certain other things, already in place, like, an understanding of alphabetical order, having page numbers in a book, having reliable and consistent pagination in every copy of that book. He tells a wonderful story about a sort of medieval scribe that carefully wrote out, a whole book, including the book's index, but the index didn't work because he hadn't stuck to the same, number of pages. So, the page numbers in the index didn't match up with, brilliant. It's full of lovely anecdotes, this book, as well as being, very sort of thoroughly researched. Duncan's an academic, but the kind of academic that knows how to write something charming and witty and enthusiastic that is accessible to, you and me. In contrast, say, Marshall is a journalist who's sort of bringing that background to the books that he writes. But, and both in their different ways are enjoyably sort of opinionated and passionate about their subjects, and that's what makes a good factual book for me. Because I'm not studying them, I want them to be enjoyable. The book I'm going to come on to next is the epitome of that sort of book. It deservedly won the 2023 BookTube Prize for Nonfiction, and that's why I was sort of pushed to read it, and I'm so grateful. And that book is An Immense World by Yong. Now, Yong is a journalist, a science journalist, but with an academic, education in science, in zoology and biochemistry, which he brings to the book. How to describe it? It's a wonderful, wonderful book. It's about animals' senses, how animals perceive the world around them through their senses. And, those senses are multifarious and often so different from ours. So, how we see the world and how a fly sees the world, or a octopus, or a starfish, or a flamingo, all different. And that's what Yong conveys in this book. Again, it's kind of, he's taking other people's research, the work of multiple different scientists, and creating a synthesis that pulls it together and makes their kind of detailed and quite complex research accessible to you and me in reading it. And he does that with a joyful enthusiasm that is so delightful. He also he brings some of the scientists and some of their animal subjects, to life as well as characters in the book, which makes it, all the more enjoyable. It's I would say I read a combination of an ebook and the audiobook, and the audiobook is read by Yong himself. And I think that meant that I came away from the book with a particular affection for him and the way he wrote it, because it's so obvious that he just got so into this subject and really wants to share it with us. And yeah, that was quite endearing. Yeah, as well as it being fascinating. It does involve a bit of, you have to pay attention a bit to get the most out of this book, but if you do, it pays you back in swathes. The other book that I read that was equally 5-star and wonderful, it's probably perhaps a bit more niche in its subject matter, but has that same quality of kind of knowledge and enthusiasm in the writer, carrying you through the book in a wonderful way. But what this book had that perhaps made it my absolute favourite of the month, maybe, is that the quality of the writing is on another level. You know, it's written as well as, I don't know, say, you know, Forster writes in Maurice. You know, that the quality of the prose, you know, matches up to that kind of level. What is it? It's Unquiet Landscape by Christopher Neve, Places and Ideas in 20th Century British Painting. You see what I mean about it being a bit niche? You know, it's about a specific period of art and a particular genre of art, painting, and a particular theme, painting for British landscape by British artists. So, you know, you think, oh, would I really want to read that? If you have any more than a passing interest in painting and how artists think and how their response to the world around them and, you know, the landscape as they see it and experience it, kind of then plays out in different ways in their painting, you know, then this is a book that you could and should read, even if, you know, Revilius and Spencer and Nash and Nicholson and Lowry and so on are not, you know, artists that you love as much as I do. Sickett, that's another borough, you know, so many wonderful artists he writes about in this book. But I think being able to write in successfully about the visual arts is quite a special skill. This book has colour plates in it, but also, you know, I did, you know, do a lot of Googling to look up, you know, other works by the artists that he writes about. But he really enables you to see and appreciate, I guess, the paintings that he's writing about. The book had an odd history. The sort of initial work for it he did when he was art critic. He's a painter himself, but he was also supported himself by being art critic for a magazine called Country Life, and he did lots of interviews with artists and visits to their homes or their surviving relatives and places to, you know, see their works in the flesh. And, you know, that was the sort of genesis of the book. It was published in 1990, but this edition is a new edition that came out in 2020, really recognising the fact that it's a modern classic of writing about art, certainly in the British world. So, absolutely 5-star, and, you know, if you've got the least bit of interest in that area, one that I would recommend. I had a wonderful November of reading, as you can gather. If you have read any of these books, I would love to hear your opinions on them, because, you know, I haven't met anyone else who's read this, for example, you know, and the only other person I know that read this one, I think, is Tilly, my daughter. You know, it's always lovely to hear other people's views of books that you read. Or if there's something else wonderful that you read in November that you think maybe I should read in future, do tell me. And you know, I hope your November's reading was as rewarding as mine.